It was an image that should never have existed. A photograph so haunting, so unnatural, that even in the age of Victorian mourning it stood apart as something far more disturbing. Taken in 1887, the picture appeared at first glance to be a simple portrait of a young boy, his eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. But as the viewer looked closer, the serenity gave way to something chilling. This was no ordinary photograph of grief or memory. It was something preserved, something unnatural, something that defied the very boundary between life and death. In the dim candlelight of a Boston parlor, whispers began to spread about the strange portrait. Neighbors who caught glimpses claimed the boy did not look like he had been laid to rest. His lips, his hands, his stillness. It was all too precise, too staged, too lifelike for a body that was meant to be gone. The photograph seemed to trap more than just an image. It carried with it an unspoken question. What had truly been preserved that night? The story behind that photograph did not begin with the snap of a camera shutter. It began in the home of a mother whose grief crossed into obsession, whose fear of loss pushed her toward practices whispered about in secret circles. It began with a decision that would leave behind one of the most unsettling relics of the 19th century. And what you are about to uncover is not simply the tale of a boy's death, but the terrifying pact between memory and science, between mourning and madness, that turned tragedy into legend. Backhand index pointing right. If this chilling beginning has caught your attention, subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and share in the comments what your first thought was when you imagined the photo. The story of the photograph cannot be understood without stepping back into the Boston of 1887. This was a city caught between two worlds, one foot in the modern age of science, and the other still lingering in the shadows of superstition. Cobblestone streets echoed with the sound of horse-drawn carriages. Gas lamps flickered against rows of brick townhouses, and in the air hung a strange mixture of progress and unease. Boston was one of America's most advanced cities, a hub for medicine, literature, and industry. The great universities were already gaining reputations that would stretch across oceans. Doctors and scientists filled lecture halls with talk of anatomy, preservation, and the mysteries of the human body. But beneath the polished surface of education and invention, the city was haunted by its own quiet obsessions. Death, in particular, was never far from conversation. Infant mortality was high, epidemics moved through neighborhoods without warning, and families often carried grief like a permanent companion. Victorian mourning culture shaped every household. It was not unusual for portraits of the dead to hang on parlor walls, for locks of hair to be sewn into jewelry, or for children to pose beside siblings who would never grow old. These rituals blurred the line between love and horror, creating a strange comfort in holding on to what could no longer be held. In such a world, post-mortem photography thrived. For many families, it was the only chance to keep the likeness of a child forever. Photographers became experts in arranging bodies to look lifelike, in using soft light and delicate props to mask the finality of death. Yet, even in this culture of mourning, the photograph of 1887 stood apart. It was whispered about not simply because it showed death, but because it seemed to resist it. Unlike the still, staged portraits of others, this boy's image carried a presence that unsettled even those accustomed to the macabre. The eyes might have been closed, but the impression of breath lingered. The skin looked too carefully preserved. It was as though the boundary between life and death had been violated, as though some forbidden practice had been employed to cheat time itself. Boston's society, so eager to embrace modern science, was also fertile ground for secrets. In the parlors of Beacon Hill, conversations often drifted to seances, mesmerism, and whispers of alchemy. The city's grief-stricken citizens were drawn to anyone who promised contact with the dead or preservation of what had been lost. Mediums held gatherings by candlelight, claiming to channel voices from beyond. Scientists, at times, blurred the lines between legitimate research and dangerous obsession. It was a city that wore the mask of progress, but beneath it beat the heart of superstition. It was within this world that Helena Morrison lived. A widow of influence and intellect, she was no stranger to the strange customs of mourning. She had seen neighbors keep portraits of the departed, had attended funerals where bodies were displayed in parlors for days, and had read articles on new chemical techniques meant to preserve tissue. But while most accepted these rituals as symbols, Helena saw in them something more. She saw possibility. She saw the chance to defy the natural order. The year 1887, then, was not just the year of tragedy for her. It was the year when Boston itself reflected her dual nature. A city of science and superstition. A city of mourning and innovation. And in that fragile balance, Helena's obsession would take root. What began as grief would soon spiral into an act that blurred the limits of love, desperation, and science. The photograph was only the end product. The true story began here, in a city both enlightened and haunted, where candles lit the streets and whispers filled the air, and where one grieving mother decided that death was not the end. Among Boston's distinguished families, Helena Morrison stood apart. She was not the typical widow who retreated into quiet mourning after loss. Helena was a woman of contradictions. Elegant yet austere, refined yet restless, admired in public but whispered about in private. To most, she appeared as a grieving mother caught in the cruel tide of fate. But to those who observed more closely, she carried an intensity that bordered on the unsettling. Born into a wealthy New England household, Helena was raised with both privilege and pressure. Her father, a merchant with global connections, ensured she received an education unusual for women of her time. She read medical texts, devoured European journals on science and philosophy, and spoke of anatomy and chemistry with the ease of a scholar. Yet her knowledge was not welcomed in every circle. In the polite parlors of Boston society, women were expected to speak of fashion or family, not of preservation techniques or experiments with formaldehyde. Helena learned early that her curiosity would always make her an outsider. Her marriage offered little refuge. Her husband, though respectable and financially secure, failed to understand her hunger for knowledge. Their union was marked by distance, and when illness eventually claimed his life, Helena was left with wealth but little companionship. In his absence, she turned her focus more intensely toward her only child. The boy became not just her son, but the anchor of her existence, the proof that she had not been left alone in a world that rarely welcomed her. Helena's fascination with science grew in parallel with her devotion to the boy. She often attended public lectures at Harvard, where physicians demonstrated advances in anatomy. She was known to purchase medical pamphlets from street vendors, her gloved hands turning pages filled with unsettling illustrations. Neighbors described her as eccentric, always asking questions others dared not voice. Could the body be preserved beyond its natural span? Could memory resist decay if one only had the right methods? This mixture of intellect and loneliness set her apart, and it also set the stage for her descent. By the time the year 1887 arrived, Helena was a woman who carried both grief and defiance in equal measure. To lose her child would not only break her heart, it would annihilate the one bond that gave her life meaning. Whispers circulated about her habits. Some claimed she attended seances on Beacon Hill, where spiritualists promised contact with the dead. Others insisted she was seen purchasing strange powders and chemicals from apothecaries. Helena herself dismissed these stories as idle gossip, yet the truth was far more complex. She had become a woman standing at the crossroads of science and superstition, willing to draw from both in pursuit of answers. When her son's laughter echoed through the grand Morrison home, Helena's world felt alive. But when he fell ill, her fragile balance collapsed. His sickness was swift, his decline merciless. And as the boy's condition worsened, Helena's mind began to turn not only to prayers but to possibilities. She whispered to herself of methods that could resist finality, of photographs that could capture essence, of chemicals that might hold time still. Her obsession was not born in the hour of his death. It had been forming for years, shaped by isolation, fueled by grief, and sharpened by the cold intellect that made her an anomaly in Boston society. The tragedy of 1887 would not create her madness. It would simply reveal it. For Helena Morrison, her son was more than a child. He was the very heartbeat of her existence. In the quiet halls of the Morrison estate, his laughter echoed like sunlight breaking through heavy curtains. He was a boy of delicate features and bright curiosity, a mirror of the father he would never fully know. Servants whispered of how Helena followed him from room to room, always watching, always protecting, as if she feared the world might snatch him away at any moment. The boy's life, though brief, was filled with the affections of a mother who saw in him her last tether to love. She read him stories by candlelight, brought tutors to instruct him in languages and music, and often allowed him to wander through the family's library, touching the spines of books far beyond his years. Neighbors recalled seeing them in the gardens, Helena's gloved hand guiding the boy as he pointed at sparrows darting through the hedges. For Helena, every gesture, every word, every breath of her son was a treasure she guarded fiercely. But fate, indifferent to wealth or devotion, showed no mercy. In the early months of 1887, illness began to creep through Boston's neighborhoods. Some said it was influenza, others whispered scarlet fever, but whatever name it bore, it struck swiftly and without pity. Helena's boy fell ill almost overnight. His laughter gave way to fevered cries, his steps grew unsteady, and his once bright eyes dimmed with exhaustion. Helena summoned physicians, their satchels clinking with bottles and powders. They prescribed rest, tonics, and whispered reassurances, but Helena's intuition told her the truth long before the final moment came. She stayed by his side, refusing to sleep, whispering lullabies between prayers, as though her voice alone might bind his soul to this world. The night of his passing was remembered by servants as both silent and suffocating. Helena sat at his bedside, his small hand curled in hers, until his breaths grew shallow and then ceased altogether. The mansion, once filled with echoes of life, was plunged into stillness. For others, death brought ritual, preparations, mourning clothes, the quiet acceptance of loss. But for Helena, death was not an ending. It was a challenge. As the candles guttered and the boy lay motionless, Helena's mind began to spin. She would not release him to the earth. In that moment, her grief became something sharper, something unyielding. What others saw as tragedy, Helena saw as defiance. She whispered to herself that this was not the end. Could not be. The moment Helena whispered to herself that death was not the end, her path was sealed. In the darkened chamber of her home, with candles flickering against velvet drapes, she refused the rituals expected of her station. The servants, trained to prepare the body, waited for instruction, but Helena dismissed them with a calm so sharp it frightened those who obeyed. She would not permit her child to be laid out for burial. She would not allow the final separation that society demanded. Instead, Helena began to act with a strange, deliberate precision. The very knowledge that had once set her apart from polite Boston society now became her obsession's tool. From locked cabinets she retrieved powders, tinctures, and solutions purchased quietly from apothecaries. She called upon her readings in European medical journals, which spoke of experiments with preservation, methods used by anatomists to delay decay, to hold the body in a state of unnatural stillness. Servants whispered of strange scents filling the house, the sharp tang of chemicals mingling with candle smoke, the faint metallic odor that clung to the air long after Helena left a room. She worked in silence, her gloved hands steady, her eyes fixed with a determination that silenced questions. To her, this was not desecration, it was devotion. She believed she was preserving not only the boy's body but the bond between them, as though by keeping him intact she might keep him near. Neighbors began to notice the absence of funeral preparations. Days passed, yet no announcement came. Curtains remained drawn, the family carriage stood unused, and the bell that tolled for mourning never sounded. Whispers spread across Boston's parlors. Some speculated Helena was paralyzed by grief, too broken to arrange the ceremony. Others, recalling her eccentricities, suggested something more unsettling, that she was attempting to resist the natural order altogether. Inside the Morrison mansion, the truth was far stranger. Helena arranged her son's body in ways that resembled sleep rather than death. She combed his hair, smoothed his clothing, and whispered lullabies as though he might stir at any moment. The boy's face, unervingly preserved, seemed to defy time. Candlelight caught the stillness of his features, making them appear almost lifelike. For Helena, this was proof that her methods were working. For others, had they seen it, it would have been a sight both heartbreaking and horrifying. Her obsession deepened with each passing day. When the natural fading of color touched his cheeks, Helena applied powders to restore their pallor. When stiffness threatened to claim his form, she shifted him gently, as though arranging a sleeping child. And all the while, she convinced herself that she was not breaking nature's laws but discovering them, that love, armed with knowledge, could push back against mortality. But love alone could not keep her secret. The longer she kept the boy within the mansion, the more dangerous the whispers outside became. Family acquaintances began calling at her door, offering condolences, seeking details of the funeral that had yet to occur. Helena, veiled and pale, dismissed them with practiced excuses. The doctors required more time. She was too unwell to plan. She needed privacy in her grief. Behind closed doors, however, she was not planning a farewell. She was planning a permanence. It was during this time that she made contact with a man whose profession blurred the same boundaries she now inhabited. A photographer named Augustus Peton. Known in select circles for his post-mortem portraits, Peton specialized in capturing the likeness of the dead in ways that comforted families. But Helena's request would not be ordinary. She did not want her son's memory frozen in mourning. She wanted an image that suggested he had never left at all. And so Helena's pact deepened. What began as chemicals and whispers of science would soon evolve into something more disturbing. The photograph that would outlive them all was about to be created, and with it, a legacy of unease that Boston would never forget. Augustus Peton was no ordinary photographer. In the Boston of the 1880s, his name was spoken in hushed tones by families who had endured loss. He was not known for portraits of brides or dignitaries, but for something darker, post-mortem photography. At a time when death touched nearly every household, Peton provided grieving families with the final likeness of their loved ones. His studio smelled faintly of chemicals, his walls lined with draped curtains and painted backdrops that softened reality. In his hands, death was disguised as slumber, and sorrow was framed as remembrance. Helena Morrison, however, demanded more than remembrance. When she summoned Peton to her mansion, she did not greet him as a customer requesting a keepsake. She received him like a partner in a secret endeavor. The request she made was whispered, precise, and unsettling. She wanted her son's photograph to appear not as if he were dead, but as though he had never left the world of the living at all. Peton hesitated. Even for a man accustomed to photographing the still and lifeless, Helena's demand reached beyond convention. Post-mortem portraits usually sought dignity, sometimes even peace. Families wanted to remember their children as innocent souls departed too soon. But Helena insisted on something different. She spoke of angles, of lighting, of positioning that would trick the eye into believing her son yet breathed. The session was arranged under cover of night. Servants were dismissed, curtains drawn, and lamps adjusted until the room glowed in a soft, otherworldly haze. Helena herself prepared the boy, combing his hair, smoothing his garments, and arranging him in a chair as if he had simply grown weary after play. To Peton, the sight was uncanny. The boy's features, strangely preserved, resisted the decay he so often encountered. His stillness was not that of the grave, but of some unnatural suspension. Peton worked with the meticulous care of a man aware that this photograph would outlive them all. He adjusted the tripod, checked the exposure plates, and whispered instructions that Helena followed with unsettling obedience. Tilt his head slightly. Rest his hand here. Bring the light closer. Each adjustment made the image more lifelike, and each adjustment drew Helena deeper into her obsession. She hovered near the chair, her gloved hands trembling, her eyes shining with the hope that this act might make permanence real. When the shutter finally clicked, the silence that followed was suffocating. The image captured was not peaceful. It was not mournful. It was disturbing in its refusal to acknowledge death. The boy's face, preserved and posed, seemed to defy the finality of his passing. Peton, hardened by years of similar work, felt a shiver trace his spine. He had delivered countless families their final portraits, but never one like this. Helena studied the plate as though it were scripture. To her, it was proof that she had succeeded, that science, devotion, and willpower had conspired to cheat mortality. She pressed the photograph to her chest, whispering words that Pétain could not hear, words that perhaps even she did not fully understand. The photographer left the mansion before dawn, carrying with him both payment and unease. In the years that followed, he would rarely speak of that night, and when he did, it was with the tone of a man confessing rather than boasting. For though he had given Helena what she demanded, he had also become complicit in a pact that blurred the boundary between remembrance and obsession, between mourning and madness. The photograph was complete, yet its existence would not remain a private comfort for long. Whispers had already begun to creep through Boston, and soon the community would confront the unsettling truth that some images capture more than memory. They capture unease itself. In the weeks that followed the secret session with Augustus Pétain, the Morrison mansion seemed to hold its breath. Curtains stayed drawn even in daylight, and visitors were turned away with polite excuses. Yet in Boston's tightly knit society, silence was never enough to smother suspicion. It began with the servants. Those dismissed during the night of the photograph whispered to neighbors about strange odors, of late-night footsteps, of a boy's silhouette glimpsed through a candlelit window when the child was already said to be gone. One maid swore she heard lullabies drifting through the halls long after the body should have been prepared for burial. Another spoke of powders scattered across the tables, their scent sharp and unfamiliar. These whispers spread quickly, passed from kitchen doors to market stalls, until they became rumors too heavy to ignore. By the time word reached Beacon Hill, the story had twisted into something darker. Helena, people said, had not allowed her son to be buried at all. Some claimed she was keeping him in her parlor, seated like a doll, insisting to visitors that he was merely unwell. Others went further, suggesting she had entered into unholy practices. Alchemy, spirit conjuring, even pacts with forces unnamed. Boston was no stranger to superstition. Spiritualist gatherings thrived in hidden rooms, and seances were common parlors games among the grieving. Yet Helena's story struck a deeper chord. This was not the hopeful call of a mother seeking her child's voice through a medium. This was something physical, visible, undeniable. If the rumors were true, Helena was not merely conversing with the dead. She was holding him hostage from the grave. The photograph itself became the subject of clandestine fascination. Pétain had attempted to keep it hidden, but copies, imperfect though they were, began to circulate among those eager for the macabre. In smoky taverns, men leaned across tables to whisper of an image where the boy looked not lifeless but alive, his features disturbingly intact. Some swore his lips bore the faintest trace of a smile, others that his eyes, though closed, seemed ready to open at any moment. Helena herself did nothing to quell the storm. When acquaintances pressed her for news of the funeral, she replied with veiled statements. The doctors required more time. She was too unwell, her grief too great. But behind her words lay a certainty that unsettled those who listened. It was not the speech of a woman in mourning. It was the conviction of someone who believed she had outwitted loss. The mansion became a subject of avoidance. Children crossed the street rather than walk before its gates. Women lowered their voices when passing by. Some claimed to see flickers of light in the upstairs windows at strange hours, as though candles burned for rituals not meant to be witnessed. The Morrison name, once respected, had become entangled with whispers of blasphemy and obsession. Boston had long balanced science and superstition, but Helena's choices had tipped that balance into fear. And fear, once planted, does not remain still. It grows, it spreads, and soon it would draw the attention of those whose duty was not to gossip but to investigate. Rumors can wound reputations, but when they swell beyond control, they summon authority. By the spring of 1887, the whispers surrounding Helena Morrison's mansion had grown too loud to be ignored. Clergymen received anonymous notes pleading for intervention, neighbors filed quiet complaints to officials, and physicians whispered among themselves that the boy's body had never been interred. What had begun as gossip was now a question of public order and of morality. The first knock on Helena's door came from a local coroner's assistant, a man accustomed to grim duties but unprepared for what awaited him. Helena received him in the parlor, veiled and calm, her composure so rigid it unsettled him more than any outburst of grief could have. He asked politely about the funeral arrangements, about the burial records that had yet to be filed. Helena answered with precision, claiming delays, doctor's notes, and her own ill health. The assistant left with doubts heavier than when he had arrived. But doubt has a way of multiplying. Within days, a formal inquiry was opened. Officials demanded access to the Morrison estate, citing both public record and sanitary law. When they arrived, accompanied by a constable, Helena resisted at first, insisting on her privacy as a grieving mother. Yet when pressed, she relented, her silence more damning than protest. The investigators stepped into a house heavy with the scent of chemicals. Curtains blocked out the daylight, and every surface seemed too carefully arranged. In the upstairs chamber, they found what the rumors had only hinted at. The boy's body unnaturally preserved, seated as though merely asleep. His cheeks retained an eerie pallor, his clothing immaculate, his posture composed by a mother's unyielding hand. The officials stood frozen, uncertain whether to recoil in horror or bow in pity. Helena, unshaken, defended her actions. She spoke of science, of preservation, of love defying decay. She insisted that she had discovered what others refused to see, that death need not sever bonds, that with the right methods, memory could be embodied forever. Her words, calm and unwavering, carried conviction. But to those gathered, it was not devotion they heard, it was obsession. News of the discovery spread quickly, no longer confined to whispers but carried in print. Local papers, cautious yet hungry for sensation, reported disturbing practices in the home of a prominent widow. Sermons warned against pride that sought to trespass upon divine order. Some called for Helena's arrest on grounds of public health, while others urged compassion for a mother undone by grief. Helena did not wait for their verdicts. Within a week of the investigation, she vanished from Boston. Servants reported that her carriage left in the night, its wheels muffled, its destination unknown. The mansion stood shuttered, its windows dark, as though the house itself had exhaled its final secret. Authorities searched but found no trace of her. Some claimed she fled to Europe, seeking circles where her ideas would be less condemned. Others whispered she had joined occult societies that promised the knowledge Boston had denied her. Whatever the truth, Helena Morrison was gone, leaving behind only her empty home and a photograph that would outlive her disappearance. Boston, unsettled and divided, could only wonder. Had justice been served, or had a woman consumed by grief slipped forever into shadows beyond their reach? After Helena's disappearance, the Morrison mansion stood as a hollow shell, its shutters sealed and its halls abandoned. Yet the story did not fade with her absence. If anything, it grew stronger. The photograph, once a private relic, slipped into the world beyond her control. And over the decades that followed, it became an object of both fascination and fear. In the 1890s, medical journals made cautious references to a case in Boston involving unusual preservation. Though no names were cited, scholars recognized the illusion. Some physicians dismissed the photograph as a grotesque curiosity, while others studied it intently, intrigued by the possibility that Helena had stumbled upon a preservation technique worth examining. For the medical community, it lingered at the edges of legitimacy, a scandalous story that nevertheless hinted at innovation. By the early 20th century, the photograph had traveled far beyond Boston. Copies circulated among collectors of the macabre, often misattributed or mislabeled, yet always carrying the same unsettling image. A boy too perfectly preserved, his stillness too lifelike. Spiritualists, emboldened by a new century's hunger for the unseen, claimed the photograph as proof of liminality, the space between life and death. Mediums displayed it during seances, insisting that the boy's essence lingered within the captured frame. Academics, too, took notice. In the 1920s, Dr. Lionel Rutherford, a British pathologist, cited the photograph in his lectures on post-mortem traditions, calling it a haunting reminder of grief's defiance. In the 1950s, American historian Margaret Ashford described it as a cultural wound, reopening each time the image is studied. By the 1970s, with the rise of occult studies, researchers like Daniel Chun argued that the photograph was more than mere documentation. It was an artifact of intent, imbued with the mother's will to resist mortality. Through each decade, the story shifted, reshaped by those who studied it. For some, it was evidence of science misapplied. For others, a relic of love turned into obsession. And for many, it was simply a ghostly reminder that photographs can hold more than faces. They can hold shadows, echoes, and perhaps even fragments of what should not remain. The Morrison mansion eventually fell to ruin, its bricks scavenged, its gardens overrun. But the photograph endured, whispered about in classrooms, debated in journals, and feared in circles where death was more than an ending. Helena had vanished, but the legacy of her act had not. By the time the photograph had passed through decades of hands, doctors, historians, spiritualists, it had become more than an image. It was a mirror held up to the human condition, a reminder of how fragile the line is between love and obsession, between science and blasphemy. Helena Morrison's act was not just the defiance of a grieving mother. It was the embodiment of a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. How far would we go to resist death? Victorian culture had blurred the edges of mourning, turning grief into ritual and death into spectacle. Locks of hair woven into jewelry, photographs of the departed posed as though alive, even seances in candlelit rooms, all spoke to a refusal to let go. But Helena's story stood apart. Hers was not remembrance, it was resistance. She did not seek comfort in memory, she sought permanence in defiance. And therein lies the unease of the photograph. To look at it is to confront not only Helena's madness but our own fears. How different are we today, when technology promises new ways to preserve, to replicate, even to simulate those we lose? The photograph whispers across time that the urge to cling, to cheat finality, is as enduring as grief itself. In the boy's preserved stillness, one sees both devotion and desecration. In Helena's determination, both courage and despair. And in the legacy of the image, one sees the warning that truth cannot be preserved in chemicals or photographs. It lingers in the choices we make and in the shadows they cast. The Morrison photograph remains, not simply as evidence of a mother's desperation, but as a haunting question to every viewer. What would you do if love and loss demanded a price beyond reason? The story of Helena Morrison and her preserved child is more than a relic of the past. It is a warning, echoing through history, that grief can drive even the most rational mind into uncharted shadows. A single photograph, meant to capture love, instead became a symbol of unease, an image that outlived its subjects, their house, and even the city that once whispered their names. Boston moved on. The mansion fell. The people who gossiped and judged turned to dust. Yet the photograph endures, its stillness staring back at every generation, forcing the same question. Was it love that compelled Helena, or madness disguised as devotion? For us, the photograph is not just history. It is a haunting reminder that the human desire to conquer loss has never faded. Perhaps it never will. Backhand index pointing right if this dark tale left you with chills. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the photograph is a token of love or a curse meant to be forgotten?